Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we are taking a fun throwback look at the Oppo N1 here in 2020. Compared to some of our other retro reviews, which are focused on answering whether a phone is still worthwhile to consider as a device to use, this video is more meant as just a fun look back at a device that was really unusual and kind of a moment within the mobile electronics industry. Just because Oppo phones are still pretty hard to come across in the United States, they're not super popular, even though it is very popular in China and in Asia, where they are one of the market leaders. But a subsidiary of Oppo, which is OnePlus, is quite popular here in the States. Still, the N1 is a fascinating phone for a number of reasons. First of all, it was one of the first modern-day smartphones to come with a swiveling camera lens. Basically, you could rotate the rear camera and it suddenly becomes a high-resolution selfie cam, which is a pretty interesting design that we've also seen in the past in the early days of the mobile space with some Nokia phones, but again, this was one of the first times that we saw it on an Android device. Oppo claims that this rotating mechanism is sturdy enough to last over 100,000 times. Aside from being camera-centric and selfie-centric, it is a phablet as well. It's extremely large, and that's the first thing that really hit me when revisiting this device. It's a 6-inch display, and then combined with the swiveling lens on the top, it actually is quite a formidable size. And then Oppo has always presented really good construction quality. They're one of the more premier brands within China for making smartphones and audio equipment. So the phone feels really hefty because they have crafted an aluminum trim on the outside edges, a little reminiscent of the Moto X series. So it feels quite expensive and heavy. Now, if we do a size comparison, again, this is a big phone. So even against devices like a Samsung Galaxy Note 5, you can see how the Oppo N1 is still larger. And then against Oppo's slightly newer Oppo Find 7, which is about the same as the OnePlus One, another very classic and nostalgic phone for many, you can see that the N1 is also larger by pretty much the swiveling lens on the top. The third interesting point about this phone is the area on the back here, what they called O-Touch, is essentially a touchpad, which, just like on a laptop, allows you to slide between various screens, confirm and select things like a mouse, and more importantly, when you're capturing images or taking selfies, you can long hold to focus and then capture an image, and made kind of navigation a little bit easier to use one-handed. On the very bottom here, we have a loudspeaker. There's also a micro USB port for charging, a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. This is kind of the metal trim that was also painted a white. The paint is starting to fade a little bit, but you can see the metal underneath definitely contributes to the weight. It's a unibody phone, so the back is not removable, and we do have kind of embedded antenna bands on the metal, which is what I said reminds me of the Moto X series, at least the second generation model. Now there is a volume rocker and also a power key located towards the middle of the phone, making it easier to hit. Now, as we boot up this phone, in terms of other system specifications, we are talking about, at the time, a top-of-the-line Snapdragon 600, which doesn't mean the same as it does today. 600 series is kind of mid-tier processors, but back then, it was before actually Qualcomm had the Snapdragon 800 line, so this was the top-of-the-line CPU. It's quad-core, clocked at 1.7 gigahertz, and then coupled with 2 gigabytes of RAM, along with 16 or 32 gigs of built-in storage. All pretty good for the time. And these are specs which are pretty similar to other flagship of its age, such as the original HTC One, another pretty classic and nostalgic phone, also has a Snapdragon 600 and 2 gigs of RAM, and the N1, like the HTC One, was among the first phones on the market that came with a full HD 1080p resolution screen, which is also very high resolution and still looks quite good, although stretched across 6 inches, the PPI isn't quite as pin sharp or razor sharp as some more modern day devices. Turning over to the software side of things, the Oppo N1 came with Color OS, which is Oppo's proprietary skin on top of Android. It's pretty far from stock, but this is one area that hasn't evolved too much and looks pretty familiar if you've used a Oppo phone. And then down below here, we can access the app tray. So at least it was a little bit ahead of Huawei and Xiaomi at the time for giving us access to the universal app drawer, which many other Chinese OEMs back in 2014 didn't actually give us. There are a handful of bloatware apps if you're picking up the Chinese version of the phone, but there was also an unlocked version that came kind of free from some of these other apps. So here is kind of a side-by-side look next to the aforementioned Oppo Find 7. So we have a 5.5-inch screen here, 6 inches here. We get a rough idea of the difference between the two, but still pretty similar looking as well. The Snapdragon 600, just like in our throwback review of the HTC One, as we said, still is a pretty decent processor. It's not going to be the most demanding in terms of handling gaming and anything too intensive anymore, but for simple navigation in the UI, it still does a decent job. You can still get by. Now towards the bottom of the display, we do have access to on-screen navigational keys, which are backlit, but they are quite dim, and that was one of the main cons that people pointed out at the time. But you are able to access things like long holding for the multitasking and clear up any RAM, things like that. You can also open up additional settings, and we can see some of, again, the ColorOS optimization, such as various transition effects. We can also choose different types of wallpapers. There are a few kind of classic ones from the manufacturer here. Overall, it's pretty simple and straightforward. I can swipe down from the left side of the notification tray to access additional gestures. So you can use it to draw different things like, for instance, a square or a circle, used to open various applications like the camera, for instance, and other apps that you can assign by using various different gestures. Over on the right side, if you drag down, you could also access some more typical things like notifications, turning on or off things like NFC, there's built-in GPS, typical Wi-Fi, typical built-in Bluetooth, so on and so forth. We can also turn on or off the O-Touch, which is that aforementioned touchpad area. So with it activated, I can now kind of swipe around the main screens using the back of the phone, which is a neat little trick and does make it less obtrusive on the screen itself. So speaking of that camera system, again, this one comes at 13 megapixels. In 2020 standards, it's not really a standout anymore. It is very much average. In fact, lots of entry-level, mid-tier phones will have very similar camera performance. But it's really that rotating action that was unique. I would say that the N3 definitely has better camera performance thanks to that Schneider Kruzak optics that they have partnered with. With this, it's pretty simple and straightforward, although it does have HDR, and it does have pretty aggressive beauty modes that you can go through. As aforementioned, taking an image by saying various commands, video could be recorded up to full HD resolution, and again, it is a pretty attractive looking overall UI. You can also change between the auto, there's a night mode, a landscape, portrait, and a smart automatic mode. So you can see that as we do this, there's an animation as it pops up on screen of the camera also flipping over. Since it's the same autofocus enabled camera, of course, the quality in terms of the detail, as well as its software enhancements are definitely more advanced than many phones, even on the market today, especially compared to devices from 2014. Although I believe the camera lacks OIS, because of this functionality, you can definitely set it onto a stable spot, regardless of if you're indoors or outdoors, and then kind of use the O-click key instead to capture a shot or use the countdown timer. Some other benefits of having a rotating camera system is it's a little easier to capture panorama shots. So you can kind of rotate it slowly without kind of shaking your hand. You're just using the motor here basically to flip around and then capture a smoother panoramic stitch, which is kind of cool. As far as more specialty apps are concerned, we have a separate folder here just for security things like power management. There's also a virus detection app, which is kind of neat. It scans if there's any kind of malicious files in terms of extension name and whatnot and tries to warn you. A theme store that you can use to change the look of the phone. A pretty standard MP3 player. The audio quality, by the way, of the Oppo N1 is very good. That is a tradition from Oppo. They used to be an audio manufacturer, but then they were very smart to try and expand their business going then into smartphones. Customization to this phone has been pretty intensive, including things like the clock, as you can see here, have all been updated and basically are proprietary versions of their standard utilities from Oppo. Now under tools, we are able to access things like a calculator, which again has been changed from Oppo. That gives it a slightly more kind of smartisan or iOS vibe. We also have things like accessing a flashlight, a torch for the LED lights. There is a built-in compass, a backup to store tool as well. So all of these are pretty nice little additions to the software. As for other elements of the performance, including web browsing, we can see that it is loading the mobile version of the site, and it's definitely taking a little bit longer compared to, say, a flagship phone from today. With a Snapdragon 800 series, for example. There is a bit of a difference here. Certain elements are still not fully loaded. However, The Verge is a pretty complex site, so there's lots of elements to load, like videos and ads, and you can see here that, for the most part, though, it's still quite smooth in terms of scrolling. It does feel pretty responsive, and after waiting a split second longer, everything is slowly coming on. Let's try something like Amazon and see how it fares. something with slightly less ads and videos. It actually loads still pretty quickly, so definitely very much usable. Performance here, I think it's still going to be in line with certain entry-level chipsets from Snapdragon, like the 400 series or certain MediaTek chips. We're still getting decent enough experience just for casual use. As you can see here, web browsing, not too many problems, surprisingly. We can also jump into, say, YouTube video playback. This is also going to be a good opportunity to take a closer look at what the speakers sound like. Pretty loud, and for a mono unit, it's, again, it doesn't distort too much either. Mids and trebles do sound alright. Bass is a little bit lacking, but for a phone speaker, especially considering its age, I definitely think it's above average and perfectly usable. You can always plug in headphones for a better listening experience or use wireless Bluetooth. So that's more or less it as far as our revisited review of the Oppo N1. Again, a pretty interesting phone from Oppo. At the time they were kind of just starting out. It was one of their first devices that took photography more seriously, giving us a pretty novel swiveling camera form factor. Swiveling lenses and different ways of implementing the camera is, again, something that has become important as manufacturers try to shrink the bezels on their devices closer and closer to being truly full screen. And it was interesting to see an early implementation of that, but primarily serving as giving you better selfie quality because of the use of the rear camera lens system. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the interesting Oppo N1 revisited here in 2020.